Good evening, everybody. This is Congregation L'Dor Va-Dor. I'm Sharon Leibovitz, and I am wishing you shalom and welcome to our chat with two rabbis. It is Tuesday evening, June the 1st, 2021. And with us, we have our Rabbi Barry Silver, who we're thrilled to have for the progressive view. And we also have our Orthodox guest and Rabbi Zvi Kahn, who we're thrilled to have with us. And take it away, gentlemen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon, for organizing this. And I thank everybody for listening in. It's always a great pleasure to be here with Rabbi Kahn. And we try to be totally neutral here. So Sharon introduced me as a progressive rabbi. I guess that's somewhat biased in that it seems like I represent progress, which seems to imply that Rabbi Kahn represents regress. They're going back to some ancient time.
That's me.
Since, according to the Orthodox, the Torah was written by God. The closer back in time we go, the closer we are to God. So he's really not insulted at all. If you say that he's very regressive and his beliefs are very antiquated, that's a compliment. Now, on the other hand, you introduce Rabbi Kahn as the Orthodox rabbi. And the word Orthodox means the true teaching. So that definitely applies that what he's saying is true, and therefore any contradiction to him must be false. So we start out with some very interesting adjectives here. But let's continue the discussion. Everybody can decide for themselves who's true, who's false, who's correct, who's incorrect. And maybe, hopefully, they'll see some things that are accurate from both sides and some things that might be able to be made more accurate. Today is a very, very special day. We're following the Memorial Day, which was a very solemn day for our country and a time that we all give thanks for the great sacrifices that were made by people who never got to live to see adulthood and children and family life, and gave everything for us. And we certainly appreciate, we should, that great sacrifice. Now today, President Biden declared this to be a day of remembrance over the horrific massacre in Tulsa 100 years ago. Such a horrible event. And what's really hard to fathom is not only that you could find so many people to commit such a barbaric atrocity, but that none of them were held accountable in any way. There was no arrest made, no conflict with people's conscience made at all. The newspapers at the time made it seem like these people had it coming. So it really shows where we've come from and how far we still have to go. And it's great to see that President Biden is holding us to account and asking us to re-examine our history. So we'll be talking about that. And of course, as we do, we'll also talk about our Torah passage, fascinating passage called Shelach. I have much to say on this passage. It's one of my favorites, but usually we begin with Rabbi Kahn. I don't want to say things that might duplicate what he was going to say, so I always allow him to speak first, and then afterwards I speak. And then after I speak, I usually give him a chance to straighten me out and tell me where I went wrong. So let's open it up now with our distinguished guest speaking the true doctrine, the Orthodox position. Rabbi Kahn, it is all yours. Please help my congregation to see the light, because they're used to my progressive rhetoric all the time. So please share with us the Orthodox point of view.
Thank you. That's a lot of pressure. You usually don't put that much pressure on me. So I'll see. I hope I can live up to that. But good evening.
You always do. You always do, Rabbi Kahn.
It's great to be a part of the group again. And as Rabbi Silver mentioned, this parsha, the Torah portion this week, Shelach, is very, very interesting. It opens with one of the most famous stories in the Torah, the story of the spies. In summary, what takes place is that Moses it looks like Moses is commanded by God, but on further analysis, especially with later passages in the Torah, the people came to Moses and said, we don't just want to, it doesn't make sense to just kind of invade the land of Canaan and try to conquer it. We should send in spies to tell us which is the best way to go and where are the fortified cities, and find out all of the things that we need to know to plan a good campaign, a good strategy. And Moses asked God about this, and God said, if you guys want to send in spies, send in the spies. So they sent in 12 people, a person from each tribe. And when the spies came back, they gave a very, very negative report, or at least 10 of the 12 of them gave a highly negative report in which they said, the people are mighty and giant, and we're not, and everything about the land is strange and foreign, and we saw a lot of people dying there. It's a land that eats its inhabitants. It's a very unhealthy place to live and a difficult, challenging place to live. And bottom line is, this is not a good idea. And that's what 10 of them said. Caleb, or Kalev, and according to the rabbis, assisted by Joshua, who was Moses' close student and associate, said to the people, don't listen to these other 10. It's not true. Have faith, be strong. God will help us overcome all obstacles, and let's go into the land and conquer the land. But the people started crying and moaning that they were in a hopeless position. And so this became a day in Jewish history, according to the rabbis, according to the rabbinic tradition in the Talmud. This day was the 9th of Av, which became a day of suffering throughout Jewish history, and a day of crying and tears, because God said, you're crying for absolutely no reason. You're crying because you don't have faith. But if you just had gone into the land and everything would have been fine, but you chose to take this path, this tragic path. And so they were not able to conquer the land at that time, and they traveled around in the wilderness for another 38 years, during which time all of the older people above the age of 20 years old died out. And then the younger generation, 38 years later, after 40 years had passed, entered the land and conquered the land successfully, although that conquest took a significant amount of time. So it's a very powerful story. It's a very unusual story in the sense that you have to ask yourself, why did the 10 spies come back with a negative report? Why did they come back? So why did they not have the faith? Why did they not have the trust after everything they had seen in terms of previous miracles and what had happened with the Jewish people, the exodus from Egypt? How come suddenly they lost their nerve, so to speak? And why were the people apparently so ready to believe them? And it leaves us a lot to kind of ask and question and think about. One of the things that I always reflect upon at this time is that sometimes the challenge for us is to see past the obstacles. In life, very often there are many, many obstacles in front of us, and that was certainly what the situation that confronted the spies. They saw many things that might have been frightening to them, difficult for them, challenging for them. And only 2 of the 12 were able to see beyond that and see the big picture, so to speak, and able to maintain their faith and their trust in God and say, we can do this. There's plenty of obstacles. Let's go forward. We can do this. But the majority were not able to do that. And the people followed the group that said, we can't do this. There's no hope. It's a hopeless task. So I think one of the lessons to glean is a lesson of don't focus on the obstacles. Don't focus on the challenges. They may be real. They may be very pressing and difficult, but forge on ahead, do the thing you believe to be the right thing to do, and hope for God's assistance and ask for God's assistance, and you will be successful, as the Jewish people were 38 years too late. And so I think that's always an important lesson in life.
Thank you, Rabbi Kahn. Today, President Biden gave an incredible speech, and he was talking about the fact that we need to achieve racial justice. And he uttered these words. He said, the creed of the civil rights movement was, we shall overcome. if he had had a speechwriter who was familiar with the Torah and with this particular Sedra, he would have said, these words, we shall overcome, come from the Torah reading for this Shabbat from Shelach. In Hebrew, when, as Rabbi Kahn eloquently mentioned, the people thought that they could never take this land. Joshua and Caleb calmed them down, and Caleb said, Yahol nuchala, or in English, we shall overcome. The whole motto, the creed of the civil rights movement was taken from this very passage. The whole message that when people feel despair, that if they have confidence and if they have faith in themselves, they can overcome all odds, comes from this very passage. The Jewish concept that when the majority of people think something's impossible, but the Jewish people says, if you will it, it's no dream, comes from this amazing passage, Shalach, Yahol Nuchal La. And the Hebrew uses a repetition. When they want to emphasize something in the Torah, they use various aspects of the same word. Yahol Nuchal is the same verb. Yahol means we can or to be able to. Nuchal means we will be able to. That inspiring passage, the creed of the civil rights movement, comes from this very passage. It is one of the most inspiring passages in all of the Torah. Now, if you listen to Rabbi Kahn and read between the lines, you start to see a little bit of some of the problem areas of the Torah, which he kind of glosses over. But if you're familiar with the actual history of the passage, you realize what is it that's really going on? Because he said, God says to Moses to send out some people, send out some scouts. He says, but if you read other portions, you realize it wasn't really God. There was something that preceded that. The Orthodox have numerous, myriad problems with the concept that the Torah is infallible. Many of them come from this passage and from many others, because this passage says God told Moses, send some scouts out. There's nobody telling God what to do or nobody suggesting it. It's just God's idea. First thing, you're talking about Miriam being quarantined after she criticized Moses for intermarrying. And then instantly, right after that, God says to Moses, send out the scouts. But in another part of the Torah, it says, oh, no, that wasn't God's idea at all. The people said it, or Moses said it, send out the scouts. And so there's a contradiction. Another contradiction that he kind of glossed over, which is also here, is that these stories all are part of an oral tradition. And there were different oral traditions that had to be reconciled in the Torah. The primary distinctions were the north and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah had different oral traditions. And within them, there were other sub-traditions. One of them has two people who contradict the crowd. The scouts, the 10 scouts say you can't do it, and Joshua and Caleb say you can. But in some of the traditions, it's just Joshua or just Caleb. There's different traditions. So here you have it even within the same one. It's talking Joshua, Caleb, and then it's saying Caleb calmed the people down. Joshua's nowhere to be found. And then it's saying here that Caleb is allowed to go into the promised land, but it doesn't mention that Joshua is. So that's another area that needs to be reconciled here. But in any event, the Torah is trying to tell us something that the Jewish people know from living as a minority population. The majority opinion is not always right. Two people plus the truth can prevail over falsehood. And so we Jews are used to challenging the prevailing notion, challenging conventional wisdom. And because of that, we have won more Nobel Prizes than anyone. We have become better educated, had more innovation than anyone, because we do not accept the prevailing notion. We tend to rely on facts and evidence and reason and education. But one of the most interesting things about the passage, besides all of that, the inspiring words we shall overcome, is the defeatist attitude of the 10 scouts. And it's quite amusing what they describe. They said, these people who inhabit this city, the cities are well fortified, we could never take it. And the people are like giants, descendants of the legendary giants of Anak. These are people in Genesis, which are huge people, actually descendants of gods and humans together, of Elim. And it says that these people are so large that compared to them, when we looked at ourselves, we seemed like grasshoppers. And surely that's how they viewed us as well. It's really quite amusing that they would think of themselves so lowly because they thought of them so high. And that also is an important lesson for us, that if we view ourselves as small, then we can't accomplish anything. And what limits us and holds us back is our misperception and our limitations that we place on ourselves. The passage is very inspiring. The only downside to it is that what Joshua and Caleb are saying is that let's go in and wipe these people out. Basically what they're saying is we can kill these people and take their land and God will back us up. So from a modern perspective, the ultimate goal is not all that salutary, but the lessons learned about having confidence, about we can overcome if we're fighting for a righteous act. These lessons speak to us through all eternity. Not only that, they speak to all humanity. All humanity has been inspired by this passage of Shelach. Rabbi Kahn, I'll give you a chance to rebut anything that I might have said that you're interested in, or you can, as you usually do, just let it ride and we can go to bigger and better things. So go right ahead if you'd like to retort.
My main comment is that I'm often so surprised and so touched by the fact that events that are described are words that are used in the weekly Torah portion somehow in some way connect to current events. And I never would have made the connection you made about we shall overcome, because when I review the Torah portion, I'm usually doing it in the Hebrew and I'm not thinking about kind of I actually also never knew that we shall overcome, I guess, is a common translation in some English Bibles of the phrase. So I never would have made that connection. I think it's so remarkable for President Biden to use those words at the exact time that the Jewish people are studying the Torah portion of Shelach. And it's just an example of something that literally in my life has happened hundreds of times, where you would think you're reading the Torah portion, it's nothing, it has to do with events that happened thousands and thousands of years ago. There's no connection. And here's such a beautiful connection. So my only comment, Rabbi, is to say, I want to thank you for pointing that out. I never would have seen it myself.
Well, thanks, Rabbi. What's also even more remarkable is that he's got a staff of there's 10 Jewish people that work in his immediate clique, and they don't even know that. They don't even know that or even mention it to him. But what I find beneficial about these Torah sessions is that you've studied in depth the Torah, the Talmud, the commentaries, and there's much that you know of Talmudic lore and other things that I have no idea about, and I learned from you. And I've studied so much about how this relates to what's going on today through my dad and other sources. And I think that it's very healthy to have this dialogue with Orthodox, with progressive Jews, with Jews of all stripes, because if more Jews would engage in this type of dialogue as we did, there's so much that we would learn from each other. And instead of being at odds with each other, we could enhance Judaism. That's why at L'Dor Va-Dor, what we try to do is take the best of all worlds. And I do have to say that I do find you to represent the best of the Orthodox world. And that's why we appreciate your contributions to the discussion that we have. I would be very interested in hearing from others as far as your take on the Torah reading and also what's going on in the world with current events. So I turn it over to everybody else for your input.
Okay, so
I do want to say one other thing before we start. One of the reasons why I appear somewhat enlightened, I don't mean philosophically, I mean that there's a light shining on me. I'm enlightened in that way, is because Arnie Pickholtz was kind enough to come over with these fancy lights and fancy cameras and things like that, which I have no idea how to work out or figure out. But Francine came in and clicked the switch for me. And all of a sudden, thanks to Francine and Arnie, I'm now enlightened, at least as far as the physical surroundings are concerned. Whether I am in other ways, that's up to you to decide. All right, let's turn it over to everybody else, and
Okay.
Let's hear from you.
Arnie, go ahead.
I was a yeshiva boy for a long time, and went to Maimonides in Boston. And this was a real interesting parsha for one other reason that was really kind of cool, is the big word, and Rabbi Kahn can back me up on this. The big word is FS. FS means but. And when we were learning this particular parsha, the big deal was that all of them came back and said, "Oh, this is a beautiful country, and it's got flowing milk and honey." I don't remember exactly what it was. It's been about 50 years since I did that. But the big thing was, after they made their presentation about how the country was a pretty good deal, they hit them with the FS, but. And then after the but came all the negative stuff. So that was a really interesting part of the story, at least from the yeshiva angle that I went to. Rabbi Kahn, maybe you want to back me up on that one.
Absolutely. If I'm not mistaken, when we did this, I believe this is the second time in the group we've done Shelach, if I'm not mistaken. And if I'm also not mistaken, Rabbi Silver focused on the word FS the last time we did this. And you're 100% right, because the other meaning of the word FS besides butter, however, is zero. And that's how it's used in modern Hebrew. And Arnie, you're right on target. They didn't just say, guys, there are problems, serious problems. It's going to be really difficult. They said there is zero chance we can conquer this land. There is zero chance that we have to actually make this happen and be successful. And so, Arnie, you're right there on target. That was the killer word, so to speak. Once they said FS, meaning it's not just going to be hard, it's going to be impossible and it can't happen, the people lost faith. And that was a terrible word for them to choose, a terrible word for them to use.
It's also very interesting that in Hebrew there was no word for zero. You're right, FS means butter, but later on in history, through the Arabs, who also got, we think, some of their information from India, they devised the concept of zero. The Arabs did, through probably India, and then it spread to the Jewish people, and then FS took on another meaning, which is used in modern Hebrew today, as Rabbi Kahn says, meaning zero. But ancient peoples didn't have a concept of zero. And many people think that the Jewish authorities didn't want a concept of zero because it could have given the impression that maybe God is zero. So they didn't like the number zero or even have it. They just figured you start with 1 and 2. The concept of zero is really the basis of all mathematics. And it came later on in history. So Judaism took a word, FS, and then gave it this additional meaning. I do remember, Rabbi Kahn, though, I usually I let you off the hook pretty easily, but I can't let you off the hook with this passage without mentioning one of the most notorious passages of all in the Torah, and I think you know what's coming, and that is that there's a guy who's picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and they come to Moses and they go, "What do we do with this guy? You know, he's violating Jewish law. He's picking up the sticks." Moses says, "I don't know. Let's submit it to God." So God says, "Well, that's easy. Just execute the guy. That's an easy one." And so they stone him to death. So I'm just kind of wondering, Rabbi Kahn, do you believe that God wrote this? And do you believe that God ordered the sentence of stoning this guy who is picking up sticks?
You asked me the same question a year ago.
I just want to see if your answers evolved since then, or if you're going to give me the same answer.
You're gonna.
So,
you're gonna-
I thought about it. I'm no longer Orthodox. I think I'm going to go with some other.
I think
you're going to cling to this.
I think you're going to be equally disappointed a year later, and
I'm not
God
disappointed
willing,
at all. I
God willing, a
appreciate-
year from now, you'll still be disappointed a year.
I'm not
from
disappointed. I appreciate your consistency. I have great respect for your consistency. So for those who don't remember your answer a year ago, go ahead.
Listen, there's no way around the fact that the Torah connects capital punishment or enacts capital punishment for many types of violations of Jewish law that nowadays we would never ourselves suggest, and violating the Sabbath is only one of those. There are many others that we would not. The world has moved in a direction of
away from God.
No, the world has moved in a direction where its concept of punishments and what is considered a crime and what is an appropriate punishment really no longer has anything to do with religious or ritual law. And so that's a challenge for all religious or faith-based communities who are maintaining the idea that a person who violates religious law has really done something wrong that should be punished, and there should be consequences for it, because society, with the different periods in the modern time, what has led to modern Western thought certainly is that the only time a person should be punished for a crime is if they violate the law of the land, and those laws can be based often on modern concepts of morality and ethics. They can be based on what's good for the country, what's important, the civil law and things like that, but not religious law. There's no real.
Rabbi Kahn, are you suggesting that modern society has advanced beyond God, that we're more advanced and sophisticated than God? Because God clearly told us what the punishment is. It sounds like you're talking like a Reformed Jew, saying, well, I know that God did this, but society's advanced beyond this. We don't have to do what God did. We're more sophisticated.
I think that might be a wishful thinking on your part. That's definitely not what I was trying to say. What I was trying to say is that I was speaking about the facts. I wasn't evaluating the facts. I was saying that modern society has taken a position that says it's no longer reasonable or sensible or makes sense or relevant for us to look at religious law and to consider a violation of religious law a crime. And it's no longer reasonable, therefore, for us to talk about punishments of violations of religious law. In religious communities, certainly in Orthodox Judaism and other branches of Judaism possibly as well, we tend to take religious law and values more seriously than modern secular society. That's really all that I was trying to say. I wasn't saying that the modern viewpoint is correct on many, many, many issues. I think that modern thinking is incorrect and is wrong. However, I do try and understand where it's coming from and what the motivations and concepts are behind modern society. But no, I wasn't saying that at all.
Well, what about this issue? What about this issue? If you saw a guy today picking up sticks, do you think that we should implement God's law and execute him by stoning, or should we implement man's law and let the guy slide?
So two things I would say. First of all, I think God's law should always be implemented, but as you know from previous conversations, the Jewish law no longer calls and hasn't called for any kind of capital punishment or any kind of physical punishment of people violating Jewish law for almost 2,000 years. So it's certainly not an issue of, there are no Jews, as far as I know, alive today of any stripe or any denomination who believe that if someone violates any Jewish ritual law, they should be punished in any physical way. We don't do any kind of corporal punishment of any kind, no matter what the violation is, and we haven't done that for many, many centuries. So no, I wouldn't feel that way. If you asked me the question in a different way and you said, do I believe that violating the Sabbath is a violation of Jewish law and a serious one, I would say yes. But I'm also understanding of the fact that the vast majority of Jews are not raised in that way and don't view it that way and are not really capable, I think, of understanding why that would, why someone might view things in that sense. But I do I do believe that that Torah law and God's law, which I view as God's law, is relevant in the modern world, and that the laws and precepts of the Torah should be taken very, very seriously. But that does not translate to any kind of advocation on my part of any kind of punishment or physical punishment, or for that matter, doing anything at all negative. We Orthodox Jews embrace people no matter what other things they might be doing, and invite them over for Shabbos meals and invite them into the synagogue. Almost every synagogue, Orthodox synagogue I know, has people who drive right up to the synagogue and walk in, and no one says anything negative to them. No one says, hey, you shouldn't be driving your car. And it's a matter of welcoming all Jews and treating everyone with respect, no matter how they might act and what they might follow and what they might not follow.
Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse or a dead stick gatherer, but it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that what God's punishment is abrogated by the fact that we've been doing something different for a long time, for thousands of years. So that now takes the place of God's punishment. I mean, God's pretty clear about what you do with somebody gathering sticks. But like I said, I don't want to beat a dead horse. I'll let everybody else decide what makes sense to them. Anyway, let's open it up to everybody else. And Rabbi Kahn, thanks for putting up with my inquiries. I'm glad to do likewise if you have any for me. All right, so anybody want to join in the conversation?
Can I add one more point?
Yeah,
Go right
Arnie
ahead.
has an, yeah.
Yeah, I
Arnie?
was kind of looking up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm over in Google at this point, and I just want to talk a little bit about the notion of zero, and it's interesting that the notion of zero, which is not a number, was developed 4,000 years ago by the Sumerians, but really didn't come into its own until the 7th century in India, and then eventually became part of the Arabic numeral system in the 7th century, 773. So it's interesting to think about zero in general and FS and kind of how all that kind of fits together.
Yeah, well, I could have saved you the trouble. That's pretty much what I said. That in India, they were very sophisticated, and the Arabs conquered India, and when they did, they then adopted that mathematical system, and then it spread to the Western world, even our numerical system. It really didn't come from the Arabs, so to speak. Like you say, it was developed in India, who were very sophisticated at that time, and then spread throughout the world. Anybody have anything they'd like to share about it? Go ahead, Sharon.
So, Rabbi Barry, you've always called them 12 scouts, and
Yeah.
Rabbi Kahn, you spoke
Spies.
as spies, and I've heard it both ways. I remember a few years back, maybe, I don't know, 5, maybe Suzanne will remember. For this particular parsha, we were lucky enough to have the Israeli scouts who came from Israel, and we had a special Shabbat, and we had Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and the Israeli scouts all join us for this particular Shabbat because of the parsha. So I was wondering, Rabbi Kahn, can you allude to how to me, a scout is not necessarily a spy, and a spy is not necessarily a scout. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
I think certainly I don't use, in this context, I'm not using the word spy with a conscious effort to distinguish between spy and scout. I think scout is a good translation as well. When when you're translating any word from one language to another language, you have lots of different options as to how to translate it. And it also depends a lot on the context of what you're going to say. I do agree with you, Sharon, very much that in English, we would probably see a difference between the word spy and the word scout. And depending on the situation, we might choose to use the word scout. And if it's a different kind of situation, we might use the word spy. And the basic idea is that when you're sending members of your own group, your own people, into what was considered enemy territory, and you charge them, you give them a mission to look around, to go around, and to come back and make a report, you could probably call that a scout, in the sense that you send scouts ahead to figure out what's the best path and what's the best approach to take. You could probably also call it a spy, in the sense that whenever you send one of your people into enemy territory during wartime, and this was leading up to what was going to be a major war and ultimately became a series of wars and battles, I think you would call those people spies in a certain sense. So I don't think that either translation is wrong. And if I had to bet on it, I would bet if you picked up 5 different English translations of the Torah, you'd probably see equally used, or let's say 6 you'd probably see 3 and 3 or something like that with scouts and spies. Let me say this for sure. I've never seen anyone attempt to make the case that you can only translate the Hebrew word as spies or scouts. I think in this particular case, it's pretty interchangeable.
Yeah, Sharon, you raise a very good question. And I happen to agree with Rabbi Kahn's answer completely, in that the Torah really refers to them as the men, anashim, but it also uses the word shalach, which means to send out. And I agree with Rabbi Kahn that because the intent was to take over this land, and because these people are viewed as enemies, and because they entered into their land and brought things back, that certainly qualifies them as a spy. And they also were going out to check out what was ahead, which is what a scout does. So I agree with Rabbi Kahn completely that you could use either word. And the Israeli scouts was an interesting thing. That was a great thing. And Suzanne, I think you held up a sign that referred to them as Hatzofim. Now, Tzofim, which does mean the scouts, was not used in this passage, I believe. I don't think they used the word Tzofim to refer to them at all. They were referred as the men who went out, but they were Shalach. They were sent out. Shalach, by the way, is related to the Hebrew word shaliach, which you might have heard. A shaliach is someone who is from Israel in the United States as like an emissary or a liaison, and they recruit people to have good relations with Israel and maybe to go visit Israel. That's called a shaliach, from the word to send out. You've also heard the word in Purim when it says shalach manas, give and take. Shalach manas means to send out gifts, shalach. So that's all part of the same Hebrew word. But remember, as Rabbi Kahn says, translating one language to the other is dicey. Sometimes there's a clear translation, like bayit means house, but then beit also sometimes means some other things. But sometimes one word suffices, but many times there's not an exact translation. Anybody else?
Thank you both. Joel.
Joel.
Go ahead, Joel.
Interesting. The definition of civil law, which were the fellow with the sticks. If he was picking up the sticks on any other day, he'd probably get a medal. It was a Sabbath, so under the religious law, it was a violation. But in civil law, which is what we follow, it's interesting. The definition brings out something. I'd like to read it. It's not that long.
Go ahead.
The system of law concerned with private relations between members of a community rather than criminal, military, or religious affairs. They use the word religious affairs, meaning it sets it aside from what the Torah, so this fell on the Sabbath under civil law would have been fine. But at that time they probably didn't have that in effect when this was written. And I would assume that this is what the modernization you were talking about earlier, Rabbi, of the updating and modernization, and the law in use of civil law in Europe dates back to the Roman code, and I understand that it's influenced by ancient Rome, and it's being used in Louisiana.
Let me clarify.
Interesting enough. I don't know how that plays.
Let me clarify that just a little bit, because as a lawyer, I studied this quite a bit.
Yeah.
In the Roman times, they followed something called the Code of Justinian, and Justinian was an emperor, and they followed his law, and that became the Justinian Code. And all the laws were written out in a text, like in statutes. And so the United States has a type of, it's called the common law and the civil law. So we have something akin to the Code of Justinian. We have statutes, but then we also have something called stare decisis, which is common law. In Louisiana, they follow the civil law. In fact, like the Code of Justinian, they follow statutes. Everything is written out in statutes. They don't have what we call common law. They don't have it there. But just to clarify something, in the United States, basically, we have two forms of law, like you say, Joel. Just to simplify, we have criminal and civil law. Criminal law is the state or the federal government versus the individual, and it deals with crimes. So if you commit a crime, you violated the criminal law, and then the state or the federal government can come after you. That's the state law. Then there's civil law, which means people to people. So if you break a contract, that's between you and somebody else. If you set foot on somebody's property, that's you and somebody else, not you and the state. If you defame somebody, that's civil law. Criminal law is violating a law of the state. Now, in the Bible, they didn't really have so much civil and criminal law. It was all the same. And what you refer to as religious law was state law. They had no distinction. So in the Bible, they have a whole bunch of laws. And these are laws of the state, which are also of the religion. And if you violate any of these, the punishment is severe. It's all one. The Muslims still have it. They call it Sharia law, which is really governs everything. It's a totalitarian type of legal system. So in the Torah, they basically have religious and state law all in one. And now, according to that law, though, people have certain rights against other people, in that if you violate the rights of somebody else, you have to pay money, or they can seek vengeance on you and go after you. And a relative could kill you if you killed one of their guys. But it's all intertwined. So religious and state law is all the same, pretty much, in the Torah. It's all part of the Torah law, which the Orthodox still follow to some extent. So they still have a Beit Din, and they still have the religious law even today. Rabbi Kahn, do you want to share some thoughts on that?
No, I would just say that Joel, you're 100% right in your description. The Torah contains laws that we would identify now in present time as civil law. Lots of different laws would be considered civil law. Other laws would be considered criminal law, and other laws we would put in the category of religious law. And what Rabbi Silver said about that all being viewed as part of one whole is absolutely correct. And if you were to look, at least in the Orthodox world, into books of halakha, of Jewish law, you could find sections that deal with strictly religious law, sections that deal with civil law, like, for example, business dealings, or what if someone damages property of another person, torts and damages and things like that, or borrows money and then says, well, a guy says you borrowed $100 and the other guy says, no, I only borrowed $50. Well, what do you do in a case like that? And that's certainly a case that could come up in a civil law court in modern times as well. And then, so you have your religious law, your civil law, your criminal law, all part of one system. And as the Western world developed, at a certain point, they did away with this idea of religious law being part of state law or criminal law, and things developed in that way.
Actually, also, the Torah was used as the basis, but in the Talmud, it was fleshed out in incredible detail. So they would take all the laws of the Torah, as Rabbi Kahn and I were saying, which were viewed as just one body of law, and they subdivided it into the different categories like civil, state, religious, and then even further defined laws regarding women, laws regarding the Sabbath. It was all subdivided out in great detail. And something else that's very interesting that I overlooked, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Joel. You talked about that. The jury system. So much of our American law comes straight out of the Bible, through evolution. The jury system, we believe, comes from this very passage where they sent out 12 scouts. 10 of them said, can't do it. but the other 2 said you could. And from that, they said, you know what? We can't rely on what 2 people say, or 5, or even 10. We need 12. And that is the basis, scholars believe, of the jury system. This very passage right here. And there's a lot else. You ever hear of a man's home is his castle? You can't go in. That comes straight out of the Torah. It says if somebody owes you money, well, let's say they're a serf or they have nothing, they're poor, you still have to respect their dignity, even if they owe you money, and even if they have low status, you cannot enter their home. Their home is sacrosanct. You must wait outside or wait till the morning. You can't enter the home. The home is the castle. And there's many other aspects of American law. Giving to the poor comes from Leviticus. Many aspects that come right out of the Torah. And we Jews should take great pride in that. It wasn't just Roman law, the Code of Justinian, because the Code of Justinian was based in large measure, a lot of times, on biblical law. And also parts that weren't in the Code of Justinian came right out of the Torah. Anybody else?
I gotta ask a question, what you just said. This is on another topic, indirectly connected. How does that relate to the Israelis tearing down the Palestinians' home? The damage, the home is taken as damages, is destroyed when there's a serious violation, or if a member of the family was a terrorist, or for different reasons. I'm reading between the lines. Is that meant only among the Jewish people, that, or isn't that a general statement? Doesn't it apply to other people? Or, in other words, I don't understand how you can believe in one thing that's in the Bible, and then you can turn around, and these are the religious people, and feel the way they do about what they do there in that regard.
That's a very good question. I'll turn that over to Rabbi Kahn, then I'll offer my response to that. But Rabbi Kahn, what do you think about that?
The basic answer, the fundamental answer, Joel, is that Israeli law is not based, certainly not based totally, but really only in part based on any idea of Jewish law and Torah law. So the Israeli law, there are more roots in Israeli law from the time of the British Mandate and also from the Ottoman Empire beforehand. There's a lot of Turkish law that came into Israeli law. There's a lot of British law and ways of handling court cases that came into Israeli law. And the people who formulated it only in certain aspects and certain parts brought in areas of Torah law and Jewish law. So if you were to ask an Israeli lawyer or a court and say, how could you do action A or B or C when it seems to violate the Torah, their answer would be, it is not our job to follow Torah law. That's not what we do. It's our job to follow Israeli law. And the Israeli law, as I just said a moment ago, has various different antecedents and various different roots. So you would have to find in Israeli law a statute or a precedent to be able to make your case. You cannot go into an Israeli court and bring out a Torah, bring out a Bible and say, look what it says here. This is what you guys should be doing. They would say, absolutely not. We don't have to follow that. We have to follow the Israeli legal code. And the Israeli legal code is not synonymous with, in any way, with Jewish law. However, I do want to mention, I should point out and make clear that there are parts of Israeli law that people developed who were both scholars of the legal system and scholars of the Torah, and they developed certain areas of Israeli law that do in fact give what's the right word? Give connection.
Precedence.
Yes, give precedence to certain ideas from the Torah. But the idea, the case that you mentioned of blowing up a terrorist's home, I would suspect has more to do with how the British operated under the mandate than how it has anything to do with a specific source in Torah law.
Yeah, let me give my response, which kind of dovetails in some ways with what Rabbi Kahn is saying, that in Israel, they had a very interesting decision to make when they formed Israel. What legal system we're going to use? Are we going to use Jewish law, or are we going to make this more of a secular nation? Because it's not just for Jews. Not only Jews live here. We have people who are not Jewish living in Israel, and we want this to be a secular, pluralistic society. So they did, as Rabbi Kahn accurately says, they took law from the British Mandate, the Turks, and different aspects. But when it comes to certain matters dealing with areas of religion, like who's a Jew, what requirements are there to be married, some of these things they delve into Jewish law, and for some of them, if you're Orthodox, you can diverge from the regular law system and go with Jewish law or biblical law. When it comes to the terrorist blowing up, the other thing is that Israel, I believe, has an incredibly progressive modern legal system. Considering that they have a hostile group living within their ranks, Palestinians who want to destroy them, they're extremely magnanimous and gracious in how they deal with them, but they are human. And there are certain things that are done that might not appear 100% egalitarian. The blowing up of a home, I don't know that they look to the Bible for that, but they could. But I believe what Israel is basically saying is, you people who are committing terrorist acts, you're committing an act of war against the Jewish people. You have now left the stage of civil discourse. You're now engaging in terrorism and warfare. And therefore, if you're going to treat us as if we're enemy combatants, then the least we can do is to destroy your home. Now, Israel is not going to go out and start wiping out their family and things like that. But they will say, if you're going to kill innocent people, we're taking your home, because this is a time of war. You're treating this like war. And I think that's why they do it. I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing to do or a proper thing to do, but I am saying that considering that these people are terrorists, it's pretty darn restrained, in my opinion. Anybody else want to share some thoughts? Go ahead, Emily.
You're muted, Emily.
Do you think the fact that Netanyahu is not going to be in charge any longer, that things will change, or will it just keep rolling along?
They're going to change, but we don't know how. Is it going to become more right-wing, more left-wing? Is it going to become more of a pluralistic type of decision-making? We don't know. It's up for grabs. I happen to like a lot of things that Netanyahu does, but there's a lot of things that he does that I think are catering to the right wing. And I, for one, would be very, very happy to see that right-wing influence disappear and allow rational thought to prevail in the Israeli government. I think that would be a very good thing. But I'm not one of those people that hates Netanyahu or thinks he's off the wall. I understand that Israel is being attacked from all sides. And so I sympathize with what he's going through. I just think that there's other influences that would be much better. Rabbi Kahn, what do you think?
Last I heard, it wasn't definite that he was going to be replaced. There is a group that's trying to put together a coalition. So I'm not sure that is, I think that hasn't yet officially happened. Am I right about that?
Yeah, you're right about that. It hasn't not happened yet.
It hasn't, Emily, yeah, I just wanted to say it hasn't officially happened. Netanyahu might, they say that he's done this throughout his career. They call him the magician. He figures out ways to stay in power, even when it looks like he's not going to stay in power. And certainly if this coalition comes together, as Rabbi Silver said, I think there definitely will be changes, but because the new group has lots of different pieces from different political parties, it's almost impossible to know what they're going to stand for and what their policies will be. The only thing that, if they are successful, will be certain is that Netanyahu will no longer be the prime minister if they get their numbers together to be able to put together a successful governing coalition. But after that, it's really impossible to predict what their policies will be.
I would like to just say one thing before we conclude about Biden's speech, which I thought was quite remarkable. And he really wants to address what happened 100 years ago and the fact that there was no accountability for people flying over and dropping bombs, murdering people, torturing people, destroying an entire community. It was just horrendous, and nothing happened. The people there are saying we want reparations, and we're entitled to reparations. This is a very, very thorny issue. If you get into, let's say as a general proposition, reparations for the Black community, I would say they've already been receiving reparations ever since the civil rights era. There's already been all types of government programs and civil programs and all types of affirmative action. They've been receiving reparations in one way or another for a very long time. And I think what those reparations have done is it's prevented people from starving to death and dying in the streets. It hasn't, of course, made anybody rich, but I think there's something much more fundamental. The United States needs to deal with the fact that we emerged out of racism and there are still vestiges. But I think it would do the Black community well, and I think it would do Biden well to tell the Black community, we're all for helping you out. But you can't just expect that we're just going to give and give and give and give you money and think that that's going to solve the problem. There are systemic problems in the Black community. Children born out of wedlock to a remarkable extent. I mean, the standard is being born out of wedlock. Lack of education and a culture that doesn't value so much education and instead has rap music, which is elevated to cult-like status, in which they're talking about misogyny and disgusting things to women, violent acts. I actually saw a guy who was talking about, we need more peace in the community. What was his name? Killer Mike. Killer Mike is speaking out for the Black community about peace. Well, why doesn't someone tell him to change his name? I mean, you have a culture here that is steeped in drugs and violence, and you'll never hear a word out of MSNBC or the liberal community. They can't say anything to suggest that maybe in addition to reparations, maybe you should try to seek changes within your community. The Jewish community has gone through horrific oppression and punishment and horrors, and we did not get reparations. But our community values education and doing the best we can and taking our suffering and using it to sensitize us and help other people. I'm not suggesting that we still have a ways to go. And what happened in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, was so horrific that even though it's a general proposition, I oppose reparations because you can't figure out who gets what. In that particular situation, maybe something should be done. But I think that we need to have a serious conversation in our community. And the conservatives need to recognize that the vestiges of racism are still with us. And the liberals need to recognize that you can't just give money to people over and over again and think that that's going to solve the problem. And right now, there are many white people who are suffering because they can't get into the college they wanted to because of affirmative action, or they can't get a government program because of affirmative action. There's a lot of inequities going on, and the way we're dealing with it could be made much better. We do need to have a moment of reconciliation and understanding, as President Biden said. I think that's very healthy, but we need to have a serious conversation, not according to party lines, but according to Emet Batzedek, truth and righteousness, about what we as a society need to do to deal with the problem, because people are suffering tremendously in the Black community. We need to figure out a better way to try to help them out, in my opinion. Go ahead, Sharon.
You said this before. Now I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. I just lost it again. You said something, lost it. Somebody else go.
Somebody else
Valerie,
go, and then Sharon will
Valerie, you look like you wanted to say something, you and Mishka.
Like, do I ever?
go right ahead, Valerie, let's hear it.
And a myriad of subjects. Number one, it seems to be a cultural aspect of our government going back years. We have a tendency, whether it's domestic, whether it's international, to throw money at problems. We've done it throughout our history, whether it's modern history or past history, we're still doing it. To this day, we're still doing it. We're throwing money away. We're giving it to people. We don't know where it's going. We don't know how it's being used. Well, we do know how it's being used. It's being used to build reinforced cement tunnels under it. It's being used to go into Yasser Arafat's pocket so his wife can buy a condominium. It's being used down in Venezuela so the wealthy can become wealthier and the poor are still living in the streets. I mean, we've done it in Cuba. It's our history. And part of that is, again, our elected officials. We are not holding their feet to the fire. We're not making them, we're not demanding, what are you doing with our money? We are the taxpayers. This is our money. It's not their money. They have no right to keep giving it away. When they start passing these laws, and unfortunately with the Democratic Party coming more into power, they're loading up a lot of these laws that are very valid, trying to rebuild our infrastructure, trying to rebuild our school systems, which are very valid, but they're adding all of this quote unquote pork to these laws again. And here it is, all this money is disappearing and we have no idea where it's going, domestically as well as internationally. Those are the kinds of things that really we have to be aware of. So as far as throwing money at a situation, as far as reparations, you know, my fear is that we're going to have a lot of the radical lefts or the radical liberals start to say, oh yeah, maybe we should do that. That will appease the situation, without looking at our history. That's the first thing. I mean, it's just historically part of our culture and unfortunate. As far as law, you know, once again, and I've mentioned this before, I have a very close relative of mine that has become Lubavitch, if you will. I mean, and it seems to me when I speak to my brother about this relative, it depends on who the Rebbe is and how they interpret the law. It's sex, S-E-C-T-S. If the Rebbe says this is what you have to observe, this is what you have to observe in Philadelphia. But the Rebbe down in Texas, who is also part of the Lubavitch cult, says you have to observe the law this way. And then the Rebbe that's in the Los Angeles cult says, you know, you have to interpret the law that way. So there's no cohesiveness. For me, a lot of the radical Jewish philosophies are very cult-like, and it depends on what sect that you belong to, how radical you are as far as believing halacha, like what to do about Jewish law. There's no consistency, you know, and I see that firsthand. That's you know, a couple of things that really stick out in my mind, and those kinds of things really bother me because we are not addressing the problems on either end. We're not addressing these problems.
Well, Valerie, I agree with you. There's too much sex in Judaism. S-E-C-T-S, too much sex in Judaism. And we're on the same wavelength about the money. There's problems that need to be addressed. Money is not necessarily the way to do it. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it is not. We need to hold people accountable. Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, I did remember what I wanted to say.
Awesome.
So earlier you said that Biden had a speech today that he talks about we will overcome, and we thought it was coincidence. However, he does have a lot of Jewish people around him, and possibly one of them might have helped write that speech, that might have known about the parsha and did it intentionally.
Well, let me say this. If that's the case, then shame on him. It's even worse, because if they actually knew that the slogan for the civil rights movement, the creed of the civil rights movement, if they actually knew that came out of the Torah and they didn't remind the world about it, what better way to fight anti-Semitism than to tell people, especially the Black community, your creed comes straight out of the Torah? Shame on them if they didn't advertise that to the world. It's a perfect opportunity to offset anti-Semitism. So, but I'll chalk it up to ignorance, not that they didn't, not that they knew and didn't share it. I'd rather think that they were ignorant, that they were so ashamed of being Jewish that they didn't even mention the Torah. But thanks, John. It's a good point. Anybody else before we conclude?
We have Rabbi Kahn's mother with us, Carol. Hi, Carol. How are you? Good to see
Carol,
you.
great to see you. Carol, what do you want to add to the conversation?
I just came in on the conversation, and I
think you have to fix your
Turn the volume.
microphone.
Go ahead. Carol, go ahead.
I'm sorry. hear me?
A little bit, yeah. I hear you.
I just came in for a few minutes and I didn't hear the program tonight, so I really I don't have anything to add. I'm sorry.
It's a pleasure to see you, Carol.
Thank you.
Anybody else? In that case, it was wonderful being with everybody. Thank you all for tuning in. Rabbi Kahn, great to be with you again. Thank you. I wish you a
Thank you
good
so
week.
much.
Thank you.
Everybody have a wonderful week. And just remember, if you see a situation that you think is overwhelming and you think it looks impossible, the odds are too great, remember this passage. We shall overcome. And even if you don't take it literally and think, well, I don't know if that really happened. The Jewish people have been faced with situations and circumstances that would have overwhelmed the average person. And we're still here. The Romans aren't, the Greeks aren't, the Assyrians aren't, the Babylonians aren't. We did overcome because we cling to great ideals and have confidence. So always, in any situation, remember these words. Yachol nuchala, we shall overcome. Take care, everybody. Great being with you.